It began with a simple steel tape measure. Arthur and Alina had purchased the house on Elm Drive not for its charm or its architectural significance, but specifically for its unremarkable nature. It was a standard two-story colonial in a sprawling, anonymous suburban development, characterized by neutral vinyl siding, a neatly manicured lawn, and a spacious two-car garage. It was the kind of house that blended seamlessly into the background of 100 other identical houses, an avatar of domestic anonymity. They had moved from the noisy, chaotic city, desperate for a quiet life, a place where the most significant event of the week would be the arrival of the recycling truck on Thursday mornings. But the house on Elm Drive harbored a secret, one woven intrinsically into its very foundations. The first hint of anomaly presented itself during the mundane task of buying curtains for the living room. Arthur, a meticulous man who worked as an actuary and found supreme comfort in numbers, ledgers, and precise measurements, stretched his steel tape across the width of the front window. 72 inches, he called out to Alina, who was jotting down numbers on a yellow legal pad while sipping her morning coffee. He moved to the adjacent wall, the one separating the living room from the central hallway. He locked the tape. 140 inches exactly. Later that afternoon, out of sheer idle curiosity while waiting for the kettle to boil, Arthur measured the corresponding wall from the hallway side. He placed the metal tab against the doorframe and walked backwards. The tape extended, retracting with a sharp metallic snap when he let go to read the measurement. He stared at the red markings. 146 inches. Alina, he called out, his brow furrowing. Can you come here a second? She appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. What is it? Did you find a leak? The measurements don't match, he said, tapping the tape measure against his palm, a nervous habit he had developed in college. The living room wall is 140 inches long on the inside, but the hallway side is 146. Alina frowned, a delicate crease appearing between her eyebrows. Maybe the drywall is thicker on one side, or there's plumbing running through it. It's an older house, Art. They didn't always build things perfectly straight. 6 inches of difference? Arthur shook his head vehemently. That doesn't make any structural sense. The wall is completely flat on both sides. Even with thick drywall and stud placement, a 6-inch discrepancy is massive. It defies standard construction logic. They initially dismissed it as a quirk of cheap suburban construction, an error made by a careless contractor decades ago. But the discrepancy gnawed at Arthur's analytical mind. The next weekend, while Alina was out grocery shopping, he began measuring the entire house. He measured the exterior perimeter first, walking around the vinyl-clad walls, noting every dimension with excruciating care in a leather-bound notebook. Then he moved inside, measuring each room, each corridor, each closet, mapping out the internal skeleton of their home. When he plotted the measurements on large sheets of graph paper, the resulting blueprint was a physical impossibility. The interior square footage of the second floor was significantly larger than the exterior dimensions of the house. The master bedroom, in particular, seemed to inexplicably swallow space. The angles where the walls met the ceiling were not 90 degrees, although they appeared perfectly square to the naked eye. When Arthur used a digital protractor, he found angles of 88 degrees, 93 degrees, sometimes even fluctuating slightly depending on the time of day he took the measurement. Arthur, you're becoming obsessed with this, Alina said one evening a week later, finding him sitting on the living room floor surrounded by crumpled balls of graph paper, architectural rulers, and half-empty mugs of cold coffee. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer than usual, pooling in the corners like dark, stagnant water. It doesn't make sense, Elle, he muttered, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. The geometry is completely wrong. It's fundamentally broken. It's like the house is bigger on the inside, but not in some whimsical, fantastical way. It's malignant. It's like a tumor growing inside the architecture, pushing against the laws of physics. The unease that had settled over them began to manifest in severe physical ways. Alina complained of constant, debilitating vertigo whenever she walked down the upstairs hallway. The corridor seemed to stretch out endlessly before her, the doors to the guest bedroom and bathroom appearing infinitely distant, retreating slightly with every step she took forward. She would blink, gripping the banister tightly, and the perspective would snap back to normal, leaving her nauseated, breathless, and soaked in cold sweat. Arthur, meanwhile, began to suffer from intense auditory hallucinations. At night, when the suburban cul-de-sac was dead silent, he would hear a low, rhythmic thrumming emanating from behind the drywall. It wasn't the hum of the refrigerator, the HVAC system kicking on, or the natural settling of a wooden foundation. It was a vast, cosmic vibration, like the grinding of tectonic plates on a dead, distant planet, or the slow, rhythmic breathing of something unfathomably massive sleeping in the dark spaces between the walls. Desperate and determined to find a rational explanation, Arthur delved into the history of the property. The local public library yielded few answers at first, just property tax records of previous owners who had moved out unusually quickly, usually within a year or two of purchasing the home. But deep in the county archives, buried in a dusty basement annex, he found the original building permits from the late 1970s. The architect listed for their specific lot, and only their lot, was a man named Elias Thorne. Thorne was not a standard suburban developer. Through obscure internet forums and old newspaper clippings, Arthur discovered that Thorne had been an occultist and an amateur astronomer, obsessed with the concept of sacred geometry and the alignment of human structures with cosmic ley lines. Thorne had ardently believed that certain angles, mathematical ratios, and architectural configurations could act as focal points, drawing down vast, alien energies from the deep void of space. He had been institutionalized shortly after the completion of the Elm Drive development, violently raving to the police about the angles of Tindalos and a terrible, irreversible curse he had inadvertently woven into the blueprints of Lot 142. He didn't just build a house, Alina, Arthur explained, his voice trembling as he laid out the photocopied archive documents on the kitchen table. The overhead fluorescent light flickered erratically, casting sharp, unnatural shadows across his pale face. He built a snare, a trap designed to catch something. The non-Euclidean angles, the impossible measurements, they're creating a localized distortion in spacetime. The house is a lens, and it's focusing the attention of something entirely alien directly onto us. Alina stared at him, her face completely drained of color. She desperately wanted to tell him he was having a nervous breakdown, that he was letting his vivid imagination run wild. But she couldn't. She had felt the crushing vertigo. She had seen the way the shadows moved independently of the lamps, creeping slowly across the floorboards. Just yesterday, she had noticed that the door to the basement, which used to be directly next to the kitchen pantry, now seemed to be located 3 feet further down the hallway, tucked into a corner that hadn't existed when they moved in. "We need to leave, Arthur," she whispered, her voice barely audible over a sudden, low hum that vibrated violently through the soles of her shoes. "We need to pack a bag and go to a hotel tonight. Right now." "We can't," Arthur said, his eyes wide, glazed and vacant, staring blankly at the wall behind her. "It won't let us. I tried to open the back door this morning. It just leads back into the living room." Alina's breath hitched. She ran to the kitchen window, expecting to see their backyard and the neighbor's wooden fence. Instead, peering through the glass, she saw the interior of their own guest bedroom, as if the window were merely a pane of glass connecting 2 interior rooms. The spatial reality of the house was actively collapsing in on itself. The house had begun to change more rapidly now, the curse accelerating its hold. The subtle architectural anomalies mutated into grotesque, impossible distortions. The walls of the living room bowed inward, resembling the ribs of a massive, breathing beast trapping them in its ribcage. The ceiling seemed to recede into an indeterminate, foggy gray haze. The familiar, comforting suburban noises, the distant bark of a golden retriever, the hum of a passing sedan, were entirely replaced by a deafening, oceanic roar that pressured their eardrums. Alina grabbed Arthur's arm, her fingernails digging into his skin. "Come on, the front door, we're leaving." She dragged him toward the front hallway, but the corridor had stretched out again, elongating like stretched taffy. The front door, with its cheerful brass knocker and frosted glass panes, was a tiny, glowing rectangle in the impossible distance. They ran, but the floor beneath them felt spongy and organic, like walking on a thick layer of rotting meat. The walls on either side began to fold inward, the 90-degree angles sharpening into impossible, needle-like points that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality, bleeding darkness into the air. "Don't look at the corners," Arthur screamed, dropping to his knees and covering his eyes with his bruised hands. "It's in the angles, that's where they come from. The geometry is opening." Elena ignored him, her gaze fixed entirely on the front door. She pushed forward, fighting against an invisible, oppressive gravity. She reached out, her trembling fingers finally brushing the cold, familiar brass of the doorknob. She turned it, prayed to whatever god was listening, and pulled fiercely. The door opened, but it did not lead to the manicured lawn, the driveway, or the quiet streets of Elm Drive. Beyond the threshold lay an infinite, starless void. It was not black. It was a total absence of color, an absence of light, a profound and terrifying emptiness that defied human comprehension. Swirling within the vast void were massive, geometric shapes, fractals of shifting matter that were simultaneously organic and crystalline, pulsating with a cold, malevolent, and ancient intelligence. The roar in Alina's ears crescendoed into a chorus of millions of voices, whispering in a guttural, alien language that instantly shattered the fragile remnants of her sanity. The curse of Elias Thorne was not a haunting by a restless spirit. It was a localized breach in the barrier between their mundane, three-dimensional reality and the cosmic horrors that lurked in the blind spots of the universe. The suburban house was not merely a building of wood and vinyl. It was an extension of the void, a physical manifestation of a geometry that was utterly hostile to human existence. Elena stumbled backward, letting out a raw, primal scream as the void began to pour into the hallway like a thick, viscous fluid. The substance wrapped around her ankles, freezing cold and impossibly heavy, anchoring her to the spongy floorboards. She looked desperately for Arthur, but he was gone. Where he had been kneeling, the wall had folded into an impossible geometric shape, a tesseract of drywall, wallpaper, and flesh that seemed to fold endlessly into itself, absorbing him into the architecture. The house on Elm Drive finally collapsed inward. It did not happen in a shower of debris and dust, but in a silent, violent implosion of space and time. From the outside, the neighboring houses remained completely undisturbed. The manicured lawns were perfectly still under the moonlight, but lot number 142 was entirely empty. There was no foundation, no rubble, no sign that a house had ever existed there at all. Just a perfectly flat square of dark dirt, measuring exactly 72 feet by 40 feet. And if anyone had cared to measure the empty space, they would have found that the dimensions were perfectly, impossibly, equal on all sides, a mathematical paradox sitting quietly in suburbia. But no one ever did. The neighbors simply forgot the house had ever been there, their memories smoothed over and erased by the same vast cosmic force that had consumed the structure. Only the void remained, waiting patiently in the dark, hungry for the next architect to draft a blueprint with angles just a little too sharp, creating another door where no door should ever be.